Okay, the storyline year is 1974. As the year began, the most immediate concern of the Brooks and Foster families was the preparation for Chris and Snapper's nuptials. Smarting from losing Chris to his brother Greg, at first refused Snapper's request to be his best man, but he later relented when Chris used her powers of persuasion on him. Greg could never say no to her. Meanwhile, Brad Elliott was trying to put out a fire in a different quarter by counseling Sally to keep mum about the fact it was Snapper's baby that she was carrying. What would be the point of hurting Chris, Brad asked, or for that matter, Pierre, her new husband, with whom she had yet to consummate her marriage. Sally remained silent for the time being, and under Peter's threat to put a quick end to their brief marriage if she didn't immediately share his marriage bed, she moved into the bridal suite that very night. Another worrisome development was the place that Lori Brooks would occupy in the scheme of things. Would she accept her father's invitation to work for the Genoa City Chronicle, or would that only precipitate the inevitable? Stuart had already noted that within a few days of being back in the Brooks household, Lori seemed to be harboring the same old jealousies she had always felt towards her sister Leslie, and with Brad Elliott rapidly becoming the focus of Leslie's romantic fantasies, trouble was inevitable. For, as everyone who knew Lori had come to know at one time or another, there were no such words in her vocabulary as hands-off, unattainable, or off-limits. Lori would take whatever she wanted, when she wanted it, and whether it was hers to take or not. And if someone got in her way, so what? There simply was no way of stopping her. And now Lori was making noises to Stuart about wanting to accompany him to the Chronicle right after Chris's wedding. Her unspoken agenda, which she was making no effort to hide, was to get to know Brad better. Somehow before the wedding, Snapper had unintentionally listened to his mother's telephone conversation with Sally. Liz was expressing her appreciation for Sally's decision not to inform Snapper that he was the father of her unborn child. The news sent Snapper straight onto Sally's side to find out what all of this meant. And although Sally admitted that the child was in fact Snapper's, she reminded him that she had decided to marry Pierre. She had also insinuated that Pierre believed himself to be the father, even though Pierre knew the child's true paternity. The day of the Foster Brooks wedding came at last. Chris had scripted the services. The vows that each said to each other were, "I join you in marriage, Chris/Snapper, to be my wife/husband, now and forever, to hold you and keep you, in joy and sorrow, prosperity and hardship, health and sickness, to honor and defend you, to love and cherish, and together keep holy the word of God." These words seemed to validate the meanings and feelings behind the events the couple had already shared and experienced. When married, their wedding night, however, was Chris's spontaneous recollection of her heinous attack. As her groom began to make love to her, she was seeing in his face the face of her rapist. So Snapper sensitively and immediately held off, saying that they did have a whole lifetime ahead of them to make love. Lori's flirtatious behavior towards Brad became manifest on the first day of her appearance at the Chronicle. She told Stuart she would take on the job of inquiring reporter, and then proceeded to do just that as she questioned Brad about almost anything and everything. On the positive side, Brad showed complete disinterest and thought she was terribly immature and self-centered. But as the days passed, Lori undermined his relationship with Leslie by sowing seeds of doubt in his mind that Leslie had any interest in him whatsoever. And of course, not to be unfair to Leslie, Lori did the sisterly thing of forewarning her that men were not to be trusted. Soon, she tried to seduce Brad. Then she failed to pass along Leslie's phone messages. And in no time at all, Lori unearthed the information that Brad was, in fact, a psychiatrist neurosurgeon who had been killed in an auto accident. She even traveled to Chicago to question Barbara Anderson, whose name appeared in the news story of Brad's death. Barbara Anderson freely admitted she had been in love with him. Meanwhile, in Sally's life, the sudden intrusion of Pierre's sister was enough to turn her world topsy-turvy, especially after Marianne learned that Sally was expecting. She correctly guessed that Snapper was the father, but promised she'd not say anything. When Pierre could no longer stand his sister's interference, he sent her back to Paris. As for Jill Foster, young as she was, she could not help but feel that life was passing her by. Her world was dull and drab, from her make-do job at Hazel's to her surrounding at home, which consisted of worn-out furniture, hand-me-down dishes, giveaway glassware, cheap clothing, and generally uninspired conversation. Until Kay Chancellor, a regular customer at the beauty shop where Jill worked, touched her life. The besotted Kay saw longing in Jill's eyes and eventually offered her a position at the Chancellor estate as her maid, hairdresser, and paid companion. Suddenly, Jill was transported into a world splashed with dazzling colors and filled with priceless antiques, fine silver, sparkling crystal, luxurious furniture, and designer clothes. Great wealth, opulence, and impeccable good taste abounded. Jill tolerated Kay's habits of regularly drinking herself into oblivion and smoking to such an extent that her husband, Philip Chancellor, couldn't stand to be near her. Jill pitied Kay and desperately wanted to do everything in her power to help her. If she could help her employer curb her drinking and smoking, maybe Kay could then do more to help herself. Maybe Kay could start relating to Philip. Maybe she could get him to love her again as much as she loved him. All of Jill's many acts of kindness and great patience toward Catherine did not escape Philip's notice, and he became inexorably drawn to be refreshingly innocent and beautiful young lady. On the surface, Stuart and Jennifer Brooks's lives seemed to be proceeding rather normally, but Bruce Henderson was trying mightily to insinuate himself into Jennifer's life again. Jennifer was managing to keep him at a respectful distance, but that distance would get shorter and shorter as time would go by. While Jill practically lived at the Chancellor home, Gwen Sherman did make another attempt to persuade her to earn some extra money, but Jill turned her down. She remembered all too well her previous association with Gwen at the escort service and the breach it caused between her and Snapper. However, Gwen caught the interest of Greg Foster when she went to see him at his law office about an inheritance. Greg was immediately smitten. He had never seen anyone quite so gorgeous as Gwen. Of course, Jill had no idea Gwen was the girl her brother began to date, just as Greg had no idea that Gwen was a prostitute. And when all the secrets unraveled, it was far too late to change things. By this time, Greg had fallen irrevocably in love with Gwen, but to her credit, Gwen tried many times to walk away from her life of sin. Unfortunately, her employers wouldn't let her. She longed to be the unspoiled, innocent girl Greg thought her to be. Greg's mother, Liz, liked her, which made Greg happy. But when Jill discovered who her brother had fallen for, she demanded that Gwen break off with Greg immediately. When this didn't happen, Jill told Snapper that their brother's fiancé was a hooker. The ensuing confrontation between the two brothers was explosive. Greg refused to believe Snapper, and the two came to blows. Greg still loved Gwen and asked her to marry him, defying both his brother and sister, and while Liz remained in the dark as to what all the fuss was all about, as time passed, Gwen made promise after promise to mend her ways and turn her life around. She had even taken up waitressing at Pierre's, but her employers were unwilling to lose such a rich source of revenue. They at first threatened bodily harm, not so much to her, but to Greg, and when she didn't heed their advice, they severely beat him. Later, Gwen found herself in the hospital, the victim of a brutal attack. Snapper, meanwhile, was having his own share of problems. He felt he had to be firm with Chris, who now wanted to start a family. He also had to endure the openly expressed criticisms of his father-in-law, who felt their apartment was too small, among other things. If Snapper resented Stuart's constant interference in their lives, then Chris resented it even more. To Stuart's credit, his grievances with Snapper were understandable after all. Mary Ann had told him that Snapper was the father of Sally's unborn child. And then there was the tragic turn of events that occurred in the lives of Pierre and Sally. One night, after the restaurant closed, a mysterious intruder clubbed Pierre over the head in an attempted robbery. For several days, Pierre went in and out of consciousness. Sally cabled his sister Mary Ann about Peter's accident, but advised her there was no need for her to come to Genoa City. Sally honestly believed Pierre would soon recover, but the headstrong Mary Ann was angered by Sally's cable and made immediate arrangements to leave for the States. There were some days when Pierre briefly regained consciousness and would tell Sally he loved her. Then, thinking that Pierre was sleeping, Sally was stunned to discover that her husband had expired. While Snapper was leading the greeting widow to the elevator to take her home, Mary Ann was exiting from another. She headed straight for Pierre's room, where she learned from a nurse he had died. All of the pent-up hatred she felt for Sally spilled out as Mary Ann vowed Sally would pay. Mary Ann would turn her out of Pierre's restaurant, then should sell the restaurant and return with Pierre's body to Paris. Meanwhile, Lori was getting closer to her goal of closing the gap between herself and Brad. She had been plotting over the past several months to break up Leslie and Brad, sowing seeds of doubt as to how each felt about the other. As an example, a love letter Leslie had written to Brad, begging him to join her in Detroit for her big concert appearance, went unacknowledged, unanswered. It broke Leslie's heart. Meanwhile, Brad wondered why Leslie hadn't sent him a concert ticket. Didn't she need him anymore? The culprit was the heartless Lori. She had intercepted Leslie's letter and then lied about ever having seen it. Then she told Brad that he was getting in the way of Leslie's realizing her dreams of being a concert pianist. Leslie called Brad just before the concert only to have Lori tell her, "Brad is interested in me." Later that evening on the concert stage, Leslie's hands poised in midair above the keyboard. It was Lori's taunt that Leslie heard. Leslie was unable to continue. She lapsed into a catatonic state and had to be led off the stage by Meister Fausch. What happened next was one big blur. Leslie insisted she had to get away before her next concert performance in Boston. Completely disoriented, she had been found wandering around a city park in New York in the pouring rain. A stranger snatched her purse, and a policeman, noting her glassy stare, took her to a New York psychiatric hospital where she was admitted as Jane Doe. It was some weeks later before Stuart, frantic with worry, was contacted that their Jane Doe might be his missing daughter. Leslie was transferred to a private sanitarium closer to home. At first, only Jennifer and Stuart would know where Leslie was confined. Her recovery took months of therapy, during which Brad had become engaged to Lori, and an act which clearly disturbed Stuart and Jennifer. They wondered how they could have raised such a self-centered, selfish daughter who would snatch the great love of her sister's life. Then, when the full story had come out as to how Lori had destroyed the letter that Leslie had written to Brad, Brad broke off the engagement. He devoted his full attention to building up Leslie's self-confidence so that she'd play again. Lori, on the other hand, quit her job at the Chronicle at the same time her first book was published, which Stuart labeled a piece of disgusting trash. He wrote an editorial damning it. Undaunted, Lori laughed it off, knowing it would be great for book sales. Brad then proposed to Leslie, who suggested they defer their marriage until she'd come to be more in touch with her own feelings. She thought she might give up her concert career and turn her energies to singing. She would buy Pierre's restaurant and call it the Allegro. In the meantime, Kay was totally destroying Philip's love with her excessive smoking and drinking. She absolutely reeked of the sickening smell of her debauchery. She challenged Philip to make love to her right on the living room floor, and when Philip didn't respond, Kay carried on shamefully with Jeff the stable boy. Meanwhile, Philip and Jill were bonding together in their losing battle to return Kay to civility. Philip showed his appreciation through his kindness to Jill. They went on memorable late-night swims, and Philip found himself relating to the kind young woman. And before he knew what had happened, long before Jill, who was fighting it, knew, Philip had fallen madly in love with this angel. Chris, in the meantime, became pregnant and was afraid how Snapper would react. Snapper had recently graduated from med school, and Sally gave birth to Charles Pierre Rouland. Chris learned that Sally's baby was not born prematurely, as she'd been led to believe, and came to the stunning conclusion that Snapper was the baby's father. This revelation so disoriented Chris that she fell, aborting the unborn child inside of her. Snapper tried to comfort her at the hospital. They'd have other children, but Chris was inconsolable. She told Snapper she would not return home with him. She had to find her own way in life to know who she really was. Chris turned to Greg, asking him if she could join him at the Leak-Aid office. The cases she worked on involved people who needed people, people who helped people. Ultimately, this brought her and Snapper closer together, and Chris would eventually go home again. Much to everyone's surprise, after being away for years, Catherine Chancellor's son, Brock Reynolds, came home again. Brock, a practicing lawyer, was her son from a first marriage. Kay had a hard time welcoming him back. He had said such hurtful things to her in the past. But now with his newfound religion, Brock was dedicating himself to helping his mother regain her sobriety. He and Jill sat out on Kay's withdrawal with her. But it wasn't easy for someone as willful as Kay to accept help. Alcoholics Anonymous was out of the question. It was too embarrassing for her to admit publicly that she had been a drunk for years, so she continued getting on and falling off the wagon. As good as he was in solving other people's problems, Brad had to face up to the reality that he had to stop running away and to begin living. He faced up to Barbara Anderson and endured her railing that he had allowed their son to die in the operating table. He accepted Leslie's help in reconciling with his parents and having them see for themselves that he was alive. Leslie, of course, drew strength from Brad, and she told her sister Lori not to see Brad anymore. She was going to marry him. By the time the year would end, there was one interesting new arrival in Genoa City. Liz Foster's nephew, Dr. Mark Henderson, who would be interning at Genoa City Memorial Hospital. Bruce had written Liz that he was hoping Mark would be welcome into the family fold despite the estrangement that had existed between them. And that's it for 1974. A little bit of trivia I have for you, too. As we know, the story starts off with the two families, the Stewarts, the wealthy Stewarts, and the hardworking, struggling Fosters. The Fosters' three children were Jill, who we still have on the shows, still to this day, although it's been played by several actresses, Greg, and Snapper. Snapper was played by David Hasselhoff, the Knight Rider, Baywatch guy, for anybody who don't know who David Hasselhoff is. And Greg Foster actually was played by an actor by the name of Wings Hauser, who has been in some movies and shows since The Young and the Restless. But right now, he actually has a very famous son whose name is Cole Hauser. Cole Hauser actually plays Rip on the very famous TV show Yellowstone. So just a little bit of trivia for you. And I'll see you on the next podcast where we will start 1975.